Today on Cosmic Disclosure, we're with Richard Doty, a retired special agent who served in the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Richard was intimately involved with UFO ET-related intelligence. Today we are discussing an incident at the air base in Germany. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Emery. Good to be here.
Now, most people have heard of Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. Could you tell us a little bit about what you were doing there?
Well, I was assigned to OSI Europe at Wiesbaden, which was some distance away from Ramstein. But while I was stationed in Europe in the counterintelligence section there, I learned of an incident that happened in 1974 at Ramstein. And this incident involved a U.S. Army artillery unit, air defense artillery unit that shot down a UFO. And that happened northeast of Ramstein. The air bases around Germany was guarded by U.S. Army anti-air defense forces. The 32nd Air Defense Artillery Force was one of the units, and they had different companies around air bases protecting them from enemy attack. This anti-aircraft artillery unit used Vulcan cannons and chaparral missiles. The Vulcan cannon were housed on half-track vehicles, and they fired 6,000 rounds a minute, and they could shoot down low-flying aircraft. The chaparral missiles were a larger missile. They were based away from the Vulcan missile, and they were the secondary defense unit because they shot down higher-flying aircrafts. If the enemy aircraft got through the Vulcan system, the chaparral missiles would bring them down, and these were conventional warheads on the chaparral missiles.
How did they identify it in the first place, and how did they bring it down?
Okay, air defense artillery systems operate their own system, but there's an ADAC, an Air Defense Operations Center, which was in Kinsbach, a few miles away. The ADAC controlled all the radar sites around and all the air defense artillery sites around Germany. So they're the ones that would have picked something up, this UFO or what they designated later as a bogey on radar. And they use bogey, and they use a designation of a bogey 1, 2, as a designator. So all the units had one word and one designation in common. This suspected enemy aircraft that's coming in was designated bogey 1, which was then considered a hostile craft.
What's a bogey 2?
A bogey 2 is another craft, another enemy craft coming in. So bogey 1 would be one craft. If there's two crafts coming in, it'd be a bogey 1 and bogey 2.
So how do we know if it's a UFO or if it's a passenger airliner compared to a military aircraft?
They use a system called Identification Friend Foe Neutral, IFFN. Okay. Once they identify the craft as a non-hostile, such as a neutral craft, they give it a designator of a friendly craft, such as an airliner. Bogey is only used when it's a hostile aircraft.
Why did the Air Force fire upon this UFO, and what did they use to fire upon it?
Okay, the craft came in, it was recorded on radar. It was coming in towards the airbase. The lieutenant that was in charge of the missile battery immediately contacted the ADOC, the Air Defense Operations Center, asking permission to fire upon it. They had to get special permission to do that. They were trying to identify it. Several other military units, one being a comm unit, the 109th Communications Unit, which is always in the same area with the Air Defense Artillery site. They were trying to voice communicate with this craft in different languages. They were using Russian, I think English, German, and I'm not sure what other. You're flying towards a base, a restricted air zone, deviate from your flight path. They only wanted to fire as a last resort. They didn't want to shoot down something that could be friendly. Well, they went through all the communication systems, but the craft was still coming towards the airbase. And when ADAC eventually, and they had to get the commander of the U.S. Air Force or U.S. Army in Europe permission to fire upon it, they got it. And when they told the missile battery, go ahead and fire on it, the craft disappeared, only to reappear at a different location several minutes later. Now, they already had permission to fire upon it. So they did. The lieutenant in charge of the missile battery told his Vulcan unit, fire. So the Vulcan unit fired upon this craft. As it approached, the bullets from the 20 millimeter rounds from the Vulcan cannon hit, but it didn't bring it down. It kept on going south towards the airbase, at which time the lieutenant gave the orders for the Chaparral battery to fire upon the craft. So the 2 Chaparral missiles fired, but both detonated prior to hitting it. The craft kept coming. There was a second Vulcan unit, what they call the last zone of defense unit. They fired and they were very close to it. That disabled the craft. The craft just started making strange maneuvers in the air. As it got closer to the ground, they fired at only one Chaparral missile, which hit the craft, and the craft crashed.
Was there any threatening, provocation that, inspired them to do this, or was it just because they're entering our space?
Well, they were flying directly towards Ramstein Air Base. Ramstein Air Base, at that time in 1974, was the command for all Air Force bases in Europe, not just in Germany, but all of Europe. It was a very important base, had nuclear weapons on that base. And so this air defense artillery, their mission is to protect that air base. Also on that base was the 86 Fighter Squadron, which contained fighter jets. But that anti-aircraft batteries were there to protect that base, and that's why they fired upon it.
Where did the UFO go down, and how long did it take them to get there?
The UFO crashed in a field some miles west of Ramstein.
But not on the base?
Not on the base. No, It was off the base. German police responded, and they got there first. The German police had an Air Force security police translator with him who was communicating back to the base. And when German police got there, the area around the craft was on fire. So they called the German fire department to respond, extinguished the fire, and now they have this craft that's sitting on the ground, not knowing what it is. The lieutenant in charge of the anti-aircraft battery arrived at scene. He notified his superiors that this craft was ellipsoid in shape, big craft, heavy metal. He couldn't identify it, and they were all trained in that. So
right.
If it was some Russian craft or an East German or a Czech craft, they could identify it. It wasn't anything they'd ever seen before. So immediately, they considered it a hostile craft. So they set up a perimeter around the craft. Eventually, a 55-man infantry unit from Kaiserslautern, which was a short distance away, responded and set up a perimeter around it. They brought in anti-aircraft guns to shoot on this craft if it was going to leave. They also brought in an EOD unit from Capone Barracks because, number one, they thought it might be some kind of a nuclear weapon or some weapon system. The EOD unit got there, and this was early morning hours of, I think, May 24th of 1974, and they were able to actually open the bottom part of the craft, the hatch. And once the hatch was open, the EOD personnel had to dress in protective personnel equipment, and they used anti-radiation suits because they didn't know what this was. Mm-hmm. They immediately determined there wasn't any radiation. But when the 2 EOD techs went in, they found 4 dead bodies in council sitting in seats. And when other personnel, emergency response personnel, disaster preparedness personnel they call, got to the scene, they went in and took these bodies out. They immediately determined them not to be humans. They were some kind of extraterrestrial, they believe. The EOD personnel couldn't figure out what this was, probably determined it wasn't any kind of nuclear weapon or any kind of weapon. It was probably a flying craft. Obviously, they shot it down. Then now they are stuck with this craft on the ground with 4 dead extraterrestrials and what to do from there.
And how large was the craft?
Craft was quite large, 30 foot in diameter. It was really tall. And the strange thing about it was the craft wasn't that heavy. Even though it was big, The EOD personnel actually were able to move the craft with their truck. That they put a hoist on it and they were trying to move it. And there was some reason they had to move it out, I guess, away from the fire. And they were able to do it. They were able to remove the craft, which is very odd if it was made of some kind of a metal that could endure flight like that. How could it be lightweight enough to move? But they were able to move it.
And where did they take it?
Well, they just moved it away from the fire, but eventually the Air Force came in and transported the craft to Ramstein Air Base. They transported the bodies of the entities. They placed them in body bags and transported them to a mortuary freezer on Ramstein. And they secured them there. And eventually, several days later, a C-5A Galaxy, a big craft, a cargo plane, one of our biggest cargo planes in the Air Force inventory, was able to take the UFO on board. And I believe they also took the bodies and flew them to Nellis Air Force Base and eventually to Area 51.
What did those bodies look like? Did you get to see any pictures, videos besides the briefing?
Yes, I did. The bodies were about 3 foot, maybe. They weren't very big. They were probably 3 foot, and I don't think they were any more than 3 foot. They had helmets. The pictures that I saw had helmets. They had smaller arms than I'd seen on extraterrestrials. Normally the arms are longer. These weren't that long, but they were lying down. The picture that I saw, they were lying down in a coffin. They had very distorted looking fingers, 4 of them, but they had what appears to be some kind of protrusions on each finger.
Like bulbulus or something coming out of them?
Maybe bulbulus or suction devices or something. Okay. And of course, I'm looking at a picture and I can't really tell from that picture what they actually, but there was some kind of object, some kind of growths or maybe some kind of a gland maybe or something like that. I couldn't see the face. It had a helmet on. And
what did the helmets look like?
The helmet was a clear, it looked like a fully cleared heavy helmet. I had a visor, but I couldn't see into the visor based on the angle of the camera, whoever took the picture of it. And it had wide appendages on the side, like maybe earphones or something. And it had a wire, some kind of wire that came down from the bottom of the helmet. Now, and that might have been attached to a tube before or something, but that's all I could see it.
Do you think Ramstein Air Force Base was a magnet for this craft and other craft because of its capabilities of nuclear activation?
Well, Ramstein Air Base had probably the most nuclear weapons in Europe. They had a huge weapons storage area in Ramstein in 1974.
Big depot there, yeah.
Big depot, and they had weapon systems there. And not only did the Air Force have weapons, Misa Army Depot, which was a short distance away, not about 10 miles, had nuclear weapons, artillery rounds, nuclear weapons. And plus they had nuclear-tipped night missiles and Sergeant missiles, which also guarded bases over there. So very well, it would make sense that this extraterrestrial race wanted to maybe recon the area. They had some way of determining which bases had nuclear weapons, and they came in for a reconnaissance mission, and something went wrong.
Rick, once again, fascinating intelligence. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure, Emery.
I'm Emery Smith, and this is Cosmic Disclosure. Until next time.